At 67 years old, Ramona Brennan walked into a courtroom and gave away a $3 million house. Not because she had to, not because someone forced her hand or tricked her into signing something she did not understand. She did it because she was done. And what she did next, where she went, and what she found behind a door she had not opened in 11 years, changed everything about the life she thought she had lost. But that came later. First, there was the receipt. The coffee was already cold when Ramona finally moved. She did not know how long she had been standing in the kitchen. Long enough for the light to shift from gray to pale yellow along the imported marble floor. Long enough for 20 minutes of silence that was not peaceful. It was just empty. She was barefoot. After 31 years in this house, she knew exactly which tiles ran coldest at 6 in the morning, which corners held warmth from the heating vents, and which stretches of floor felt like stepping onto something that did not want you there. She had learned a great many things about this house. She had learned to move through it quietly, to occupy it without disturbing it, to make herself small enough that the rooms never had to acknowledge she was in them. She set the coffee down on the counter. That was when she saw it, a piece of paper folded once. She recognized the logo before she reached for it. A hotel downtown, the kind with a restaurant on the ground floor and a bar on the 42nd story, and rooms that cost more per night than most families spent on groceries in a week. She unfolded it. Judson's name. 14 nights, last month. She stood very still. Somewhere outside, a car engine turned over and pulled away into the morning. She read the dates again, then she set the paper down. Slowly, the way she had done this before. Because this was not the first time. 14 months ago, she had found the first receipt tucked inside a jacket pocket she was sending to the dry cleaner. She had stared at it for a long time in the laundry room, holding it between her thumb and forefinger, the way you hold something that might cut you if you grip too hard. Then she had folded it and placed it in the back of the drawer beside the stove underneath the takeout menus and the expired coupons and the other small pieces of paper that lived there, because no one had ever decided whether to keep them or throw them away. 6 months after that, the second one, a credit card statement, this time left in the pocket of his briefcase when he asked her to find his reading glasses. 3 dinners at a restaurant she had never been to. She recognized the address. She had driven past it once, the kind of place with low lighting and heavy curtains and a front entrance positioned so that you could walk in without being seen from the street. She put that statement in the same drawer. She told herself she needed more time, more certainty, more of something she could not name but knew she did not have enough of yet. This was the third time. She already knew how to fold the paper so it fit exactly in the back of the drawer. She had the motion memorized. She picked it up again and held it and felt the weight of it, which was nothing at all, and which was also the heaviest thing she had ever carried in this kitchen. And then she did something she had not done the first 2 times. She left it on the counter. She left it right there in the open in the pale morning light, where it could be seen by anyone who walked into the room, and she went to get dressed. She had an appointment at 9 o'clock. A courtroom downtown. A judge who had read through 31 years of a marriage and reduced it to a stack of documents 2 inches thick. She had not decided yet what she was going to do. Or maybe she had. Maybe she had decided 14 months ago the first time she opened that drawer. Maybe she had just needed 3 receipts to be sure. The courtroom smelled like old wood and something faintly chemical, like cleaning solution that had been applied so many times it had become part of the walls. Ramona had expected the room to feel larger. It did not. It was modest with fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency just below hearing, and wooden benches worn smooth by decades of people sitting in them with the worst mornings of their lives. She sat with her hands in her lap, not performing stillness, Just still the way you get when you have been bracing for something so long that the bracing becomes a kind of rest. Across the room, Judson sat with his attorney. The attorney was young, sharp suit, kept checking his phone under the table every few minutes. That told Ramona everything she needed to know about how he expected the morning to go. Quick, routine. A signature, a handshake, and everyone moves on to lunch. Judson had not looked at her once. Not when they entered. Not when the proceedings began. Not through 40 minutes of lawyers exchanging the language of dissolution, wage and entitlements, and equitable distribution, and the division of 31 years into columns on a spreadsheet. He sat with his shoulders angled slightly away from her, the posture of a man who had already left a room he was still physically in. Her own lawyer, Nadine, was doing her job well. Ramona could hear that much even through the fog of her own thoughts. She heard the words primary homemaker and career sacrifice, and she understood that Nadine was building something careful and sound on her behalf, brick by legal brick. Nadine had spent 3 weeks preparing for this. She believed in the case. She believed Ramona deserved what the law entitled her to. But Ramona was not listening to Nadine. She was watching Judson's hands. She had known those hands for 31 years. The way the left one drummed on his thigh when he was thinking a rhythm only she would recognize. The particular stillness of them when he had already made a decision and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. She watched them now, and they looked like the hands of someone she had met once at a party and could not quite place. She thought, I do not know this person. Not with anger, not with the kind of grief that comes with sharp edges and broken glass. More like standing in a room you lived in for decades after every piece of furniture has been carried out. You recognize the shape of the space. You can see where the couch was by the wear pattern on the carpet. But the room does not hold what it used to hold, and no amount of staring at the walls will put it back. Nadine was mid-sentence when Ramona said, I would like to speak. The room shifted. The judge looked up from his papers for the first time all morning. Nadine turned her mouth still open around the words she had not finished. Judson's attorney stopped typing on his laptop. The court reporter's fingers paused above the keys. Judson still did not look at her. Ramona addressed the judge directly. Her voice was not steady because she was brave. It was steady because she was finished. Your Honor, I would like to accept a settlement of $120,000 and release my claim to the marital property. Silence. The kind that has weight to it, that presses against the walls and makes the fluorescent light sound louder. Nadine's hand found her arm immediately. Ramona, her voice was low, urgent, professional, alarm barely contained. Ramona shook her head. Once, small. The judge leaned forward. He removed his glasses and set them on the bench, a gesture Ramona recognized as the kind people make when they want to see someone more clearly. He asked if she understood what she was giving up. He named the appraised value of the house. He used the word irrevocable. He said it twice as if the first time might not have reached her. I understand, Ramona said. I am 67 years old. I do not have enough time left to spend it fighting over the wrong things. She signed where they indicated. 3 pages. Her name in the spaces marked with small adhesive arrows. The pen moved across the paper, and that was the only sound, that faint scratching, the sound of 31 years being released in blue ink. Nadine looked at her with an expression Ramona had seen before but never directed at herself. The look people give someone standing at the edge of something very high, not certain whether to reach out or step back or simply bear witness. From across the room, Judson spoke for the first time all morning. His voice was even practiced, the voice of a man who had spent a career in boardrooms learning how to make his words land with the weight of reason. You will regret this. A pause. When you realize what you have done, when you have nowhere to go and no one left to call, you will wish you had been more practical. Ramona heard the words. She registered them the way you register the sound of a car alarm going off 3 streets away, present but not relevant, because she was already somewhere else. She was thinking about a house she had not been inside in 11 years. A small house, 1 story, a street called Elm, a key she had carried so long the brass had worn smooth against her palm, and she had never once explained to anyone why she kept it. She stood up. She did not look at Judson. She walked out of the courtroom into the afternoon, and the light outside was the ordinary light of an ordinary Thursday. And the city moved around her the way it always does, indifferent and continuous. In her purse was a key she had been carrying for 11 years without ever telling a single person why. The drive took 50 minutes. She went without music, without the radio, without the podcast Judson used to play during long drives that she pretended to enjoy. Just the sound of the highway thinning out the city, letting go of her mile by mile. Fewer lanes, lower buildings, parking structures replaced by front yards with mailboxes and garden hoses left out on the lawn. At some point, the highway became an avenue, and the avenue became a residential street, and the street became the kind of neighborhood where people waved from their porches at cars they did not recognize, not because they were friendly, but because they had nothing more urgent to do. Number 12 Elm Street, 1 story, maybe 1,100 square feet. The white paint had gone the color of old paper, yellowed and soft peeling at the corners, where moisture had worked its way under the surface over too many seasons. One side of the porch dipped lower than the other, a slow structural lean that had been settling for years. The mailbox tilted at an angle that suggested it had been hit by something and never straightened. A maple tree she did not remember planting had grown up through the corner of the front yard and now threw shade across the entire left side of the house, its roots cracking the edge of the walkway. She had kept the key for 11 years. Judson had assumed they would sell this house when they moved to the mansion. The paperwork had been discussed. Realtors had been mentioned. She had never quite gotten around to it, and eventually Judson had stopped asking, and the house had sat here empty, held in a kind of suspension between the life they had left behind and the life they had built in its place. The key turned slowly. She had to work it jiggling twice before the lock gave. The door swung inward with a sound that was not quite a creak, more like a long exhale, the way old houses breathe when someone finally comes back to them. She stood in the doorway and did not go in right away. The smell reached her first, dust and closed air, and something underneath both of those. Old wood, the dry warmth of a house that has been sealed through several summers without anyone opening a window or running a fan. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of waiting. She stepped inside. The floors were hardwood under a layer of grime. The walls still held their original color, a soft yellow she had chosen from a strip of paint samples at a hardware store 35 years ago when she and Judson were 29 and 32, and the biggest argument they had was whether to go with sunlit wheat or morning cream. She had won. She had picked the yellow and painted 2 coats herself on a Saturday, while Judson assembled a bookshelf in the living room, and they listened to the radio and ordered pizza at 8 o'clock because neither of them wanted to stop working. The kitchen was to the left. Same linoleum she had always meant to replace. The bathroom straight ahead. The faucet dripped once when she touched the handle, a single drop that caught the light, then went quiet. 2 bedrooms down the short hallway. The first hers and Judson's. She stood in the doorway and looked at it without entering. The carpet had a stain near the window she could not place. The closet door was slightly open. She pulled it shut and kept moving. Then she went to Preston's room. It was smaller than she remembered. Or maybe she had just gotten used to bigger spaces, higher ceilings, rooms designed to impress rather than to hold. A single window looked out onto the side yard where the maple tree pressed its branches close to the glass. The closet door still had the same crystal knob, slightly loose, that she had been meaning to tighten since 1994. And on the door frame, the one between the room and the hallway, the marks were still there. Pencil, dates written in her own hand, small notations beside each line. 6 months, 1 year, 18 months. She had measured him every 6 months when he was little, then every year after he grew old enough to stand still over it without fidgeting. The marks climbed the frame in a column of ordinary devotion, each one recording a moment that had seemed unremarkable at the time and was now the most important thing on this wall. 2 years, 3 years, 4 years October. She put her finger on the lowest mark. The wood was smooth there, slightly paler where the pencil had faded, but the impression had not. She could feel the groove where she had pressed down hard enough to make it last. 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. The last mark was up near her shoulder. August 12th, first day of school. She remembered that morning with a clarity that startled her. Preston in new sneakers, a backpack so large it looked like it was wearing him, instead of the other way around, standing against this door frame, while she searched for the pencil she kept on the kitchen windowsill. He had been nervous. She could see it in the way he held his shoulders pulled up tight toward his ears. She had pretended not to notice. She made a small ceremony of the measuring instead. Stand up straight, chin level, hold still, there you go. She drew the line and wrote the date and told him he had grown 2 whole inches since Christmas, which may or may not have been true, but it made him stand a little taller. Judson had not been there. He had a meeting that morning. Something that could not be moved, he said. She had understood, or told herself she did. She had taken Preston to school alone and come back to this house and stood in this doorway for a while before getting on with her day. He missed it. She had not thought about that in 30 years. She stood there a moment longer, her fingers still on the last pencil mark, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not breaking, settling. The way the foundation of a house settles after years of holding weight, it was not designed for not collapsing, just finding a new position, lower, closer to the ground, closer to something solid. She sat down on the floor, back against the wall, courthouse clothes and all. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and lay across the dusty floorboards in a long golden stripe that moved so slowly you could only see it had moved if you looked away and looked back. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. A car passed on the street, its engine fading, until the only sound left was the house itself, the faint settling of old wood, the particular quiet of a place that had been waiting and did not mind waiting a little longer. She had not cried at the courthouse. She had not cried in the car. She had not cried standing in the doorway or walking through the rooms or touching the faucet that dripped once and stopped. She cried now, sitting on the floor of her son's old bedroom with her back against the wall and her courthouse shoes beside her and her purse still over her shoulder. She cried, not because she was tired exactly, because she had just remembered what it felt like to be in a place where she had been completely herself, and the remembering was so sharp and so sudden that her body did not know what else to do with it. She woke up on the floor. Her back ached and her neck had a crick from the sleeping bag bunching up sometime in the night. She did not remember falling asleep. She remembered the crying tapering off and then lying down on the dusty floor and then pulling the sleeping bag from her overnight bag, the one practical thing she had thought to pack, and wrapping it around herself, and then nothing. Morning light came in flat and pale through a window that had not been cleaned in years. Water stain on the ceiling in the corner she did not remember. The house was still. She was 67 years old, and she was lying on the floor of an empty house, and she had $120,000 and a key and no plan beyond this moment. Then someone knocked. Not urgent, just patient. The knock of a person who had nowhere else to be and would wait as long as it took. She got up slowly and went to the front door and opened it to a woman about her age, maybe a few years younger, standing on the sagging porch with a loaf of bread wrapped in a blue dish towel. The bread was still warm. Ramona could feel the heat of it from where she stood, radiating through the cloth like a small, quiet heartbeat. The woman said, "I saw your light on last night. I am Verna. I live at 14. She held out the bread. That was all. No questions. No careful tilting of the head that meant she had noticed something was wrong and wanted credit for noticing. "No, are you all right? Know what happened? Just the bread and her name and the number of her house." Ramona took it. They ended up sitting on the floor of the kitchen because there was nowhere else to sit. Ramona made coffee on the camping stove from her overnight bag, guessing at the ratio of grounds to water, and Verna sat with her legs crossed and held her mug with both hands and looked around the room without comment. She mentioned a few things about the street in the easy way of someone sharing directions to a gas station. The man at number 9 who grew excellent tomatoes and sometimes left a bag on your front step without saying anything. A woman across the street named Reva, who ran the community garden at the end of the block. A hardware store 2 streets over, locally owned, that gave a senior discount on Tuesdays. She did not ask what had brought Ramona here. She did not ask about the rest of it. She simply sat on the floor and drank bad coffee and shared the bread she had brought, tearing it along the grain with her hands, the way someone does when they have done it 1,000 times, when bread is just bread and sharing it is just what you do. Before she left, Verna paused at the door. "I moved here 7 years ago," she said. "Alone. First loaf of bread I got came from a woman who used to live next door. Mavis. She passed 2 years ago." A small pause. "I still make an extra loaf sometimes." She was gone before Ramona could find the words to respond. The door closed softly. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. The quiet of a room where someone has just been, where the air still holds the shape of their presence. Ramona sat back down on the floor and finished her coffee, which had gone lukewarm and was too strong, and was the best cup of coffee she had tasted in longer than she could remember. She ate the rest of the bread slowly. Outside, someone's lawnmower started up, and the sound came through the thin walls with a clarity that the mansion's triple-pane windows would never have allowed. An ordinary morning sound, a Tuesday neighborhood sound. She had not heard that sound in a very long time. Ramona spent the rest of that week emptying the hall closet. It held everything she and Judson had not thought worth taking when they moved to the mansion 30 years ago, but neither had bothered to throw away. Old tax documents with figures that seemed impossibly small now. A broken clock radio with a crack running across its face. A pair of curtains still in their plastic packaging, bought for a window that turned out to be the wrong size, kept, because returning them felt like admitting a mistake. Boxes within boxes, the archaeology of a life that had stopped being examined. The shoebox was on the highest shelf. She had to stand on a chair to reach it, and even then her fingers only brushed the edge before she managed to hook it forward. She brought it down and sat on the floor with it in her lap. Inside, a diary with a blue cover. The kind you buy at a drugstore for $4, nothing special. The sort of thing you pick up along with toothpaste and a birthday card and forget you bought until you find it in the bag later. A pen clipped into the spine, the ink long dried, and underneath the diary, folded small, a piece of notepaper in her own handwriting. A grocery list from what looked like 2019. Milk bread, call the dentist. the ordinary record of an ordinary day that had no idea what was coming. She set the grocery list aside. She opened the diary. The first entry was dated a little over a year before she left the mansion. She recognized her own handwriting and felt the strange vertigo of reading words you wrote in a different version of your life. The person who had written these pages was her, and was also someone she had to squint to recognize the way you squint at a photograph taken in a room you lived in but cannot quite place. She had written about the first receipt, the hotel downtown, Judson's name. She had written about standing in the kitchen holding it and about the drawer beside the stove and about her reasons for putting it there instead of holding it up to the light. She had not written "I was afraid." She had written around it, circling the things she could not say directly with other words and other observations until the shape of it became visible anyway. The way you can see the outline of something submerged just below the surface of dark water. But one sentence she had written plainly, "If I do not look at it, perhaps it is not real." She sat with that for a moment, then she turned pages. The entries came regularly at first, every few days, sometimes daily. She wrote about the house, about Judson, about Preston, who had just started a new job in Chicago and called on Sundays. She wrote about small things, a dinner party she had organized where the conversation went well, a garden she had seen in a magazine and thought about starting but never did. The entries had the quality of a person talking to herself in a room where the door was locked, not because anyone was listening, but because there was no one else to talk to. Then 6 months in the second receipt, the credit card statement. She had written about that too, but the handwriting on that page was different, smaller. The pen had pressed harder, leaving grooves in the paper you could feel with your fingertip, the way handwriting changes when the hand holding it is working to stay steady. She had written 3 paragraphs and crossed out 2 of them with lines so heavy the words underneath were completely buried. What remained was a single sentence. "I told myself I would know when it was time." After that, the entries grew shorter, then sporadic. Then there were days, a week, 2 weeks, a month, 6 weeks of nothing. The writing of someone who had started a conversation with herself and was finding it harder and harder to continue, not because she had run out of things to say, but because saying them was beginning to cost more than staying silent. The last entry was dated the morning of her 65th birthday, 2 years before the courthouse, 2 years before the third receipt, 2 years before this floor and this empty house and this diary in her lap. She had written a full page front and back. Ramona read it slowly. It was the most honest thing in the diary. The kind of writing that comes when you have stopped performing even for yourself, when it is 3 in the morning and the house is asleep and it is just you and the page and the thing you have been not saying for 2 years, and you are so tired of not saying it that the words come out before you can arrange them into something more careful. At the bottom of the page, the last 2 sentences. "Today, I promised myself I would be braver, but I do not yet know what brave looks like." She turned the page. Blank. Turned another. Blank. She fanned through the remaining pages with her thumb, all of them empty white, waiting for entries that never came. Pages that had been ready to hold whatever she needed to say, and she had given them nothing. 2 years of silence pressed between cardboard covers. She closed the diary and set it on the kitchen table in front of her. Outside the window, the sky had gone fully dark. She looked at the blue cover for a long time. She had made that promise on her 65th birthday. She had then spent 2 more years in the same house, at the same table, getting up every morning and choosing the same silence. Not because she was weak, because the truth had a weight to it that she had not figured out how to carry. Because the life she would have to dismantle In order to speak, it was also the life that contained her son. Her history, every version of herself she had ever been. You do not set fire to a house while you are still inside it. You wait until you find the door. She understood now why she had stopped writing. Writing made it real. Real meant she had to act, and she had not been ready. 2 years of empty pages. She had stopped writing the day she decided to stop pretending, and then spent 2 more years pretending anyway. Waiting for courage, she realized, was just another name for fear. Ramona set the diary on the table. She did not put it back in the shoebox. She did not return it to the highest shelf where things went when she was not ready to look at them. She left it out on the table where she could see it. Outside the kitchen window, the last light was draining from the sky. Down the street, Verna's porch light came on a small, warm glow visible through the bare branches of the maple tree. Ramona did not know what tomorrow would look like. She did not have a plan. She had $120,000, a house that needed everything, a diary full of promises she had not kept, and a street she did not yet know. But for the first time in longer than she could measure, she had not folded the truth into a small square and placed it in the back of a drawer. She had left it out. She had left it open, and she was still here. The garden smelled like wet soil and something growing, which was more than Ramona could say for most things in her life right now. Verna had walked her down at 7:30 before the heat came in. The lot sat at the end of Elm Street, where the road curved and dead-ended, a patch of ground that might have been a parking area once, or might have been nothing at all, and had been turned by the people on this street into something that fed them. Raised beds in neat rows built from salvaged lumber and held together with screws that had been tightened more than once. A small greenhouse along the back fence, its plastic panels fogged with condensation from inside. 12 people working quietly in the early morning, the way people work when they know what they are doing and do not need to talk about it. Verna introduced her around. Names came and went. Ramona nodded and tried to hold on to them, matching faces to the houses Verna had described over that first cup of bad coffee. Then Verna said, "And this is Reva." The woman was 71, maybe 72, small with the kind of posture that comes from decades of refusing to slouch. Her hands were working a row of late-season greens, and she did not stop when Verna spoke her name. She looked up at Ramona with an expression that contained no warmth and no hostility. It was assessment, the look of a woman who had been measuring people her entire life and had learned to do it in under 5 seconds. She did not say hello. She said, "Are you planning to stay or are you just passing through?" Ramona looked at her. The morning air was cool on her arms. Behind Reva, a row of bean plants climbed a wooden trellis that someone had built with care, each support tied with cotton string instead of wire. "I do not know yet," Ramona said, "but I am here today." Reva held her gaze for one more beat. Then she turned back to her plants. Someone handed Ramona a pair of gloves and pointed her toward the row of beans that ran parallel to Reva's. She pulled the gloves on and got to work. They went 2 hours without exchanging a word. Ramona learned things about Reva without being told them. The way her hands moved down a row, never fast but never pausing, checking each plant with the same brief attention, a touch here, a pinch there, nothing wasted. She did not consult anyone. She did not hesitate. She knew this garden the way a carpenter knows his workshop, by feel, by repetition, by the memory stored in her hands rather than her head. Ramona was pulling weeds from the base of a bean plant when she felt resistance. She looked down and realized she had gotten hold of a seedling instead. Young, maybe 3 inches tall, its stem so thin it bent between her fingers. She had pulled it halfway out before she noticed. She froze. Reva's hand appeared beside hers. No words. Just one finger pointing down at the soil at the small hole where the seedling had been. Ramona pressed it back in, firmed the earth around it with her thumb. felt the cool, damp weight of the dirt packing against the tiny root. Reva's hand withdrew. They kept working. At the end of the morning, as people were rinsing tools and stacking pots near the greenhouse, a man Ramona did not know came to stand beside her while she was washing her hands at the outdoor tap. He was older, moving slowly, wearing a veteran's cap faded to the color of dust. Fletcher. He spoke quietly, not looking at her the way you say something you are not sure needs to be said, but that sits wrong in your chest if you keep it to yourself. Reva's husband passed last year, Carlton. He planted that row of beans. He walked away before she could respond. Ramona turned and looked back across the garden to where Reva was still working, bent low over the row, her hands moving through the leaves with that same steady certainty. She had put her hands into the grief of a stranger without knowing it had nearly torn out the thing that stranger was still tending, and Reva had simply pointed at the soil and waited for her to fix it. She looked down at her own hands, dirt under her thumbnail from pressing the seedling back, and something else she could not name, the first faint sense that she had arrived somewhere that was going to matter. Ramona taught herself to do things that autumn. She watched a video on her phone 3 times and then climbed a ladder to replace the recessed bulbs in the kitchen ceiling, going up twice and coming back down once for a screwdriver she had left on the counter. She repainted the kitchen window frame on a Tuesday, using a trim brush from the hardware store where the man at the counter told her to go with satin finish because it held up better in humidity. The first coat was rough. She could see every hesitation of her hand preserved in the uneven surface. The second coat, she slowed down, let the brush carry the paint instead of pushing it, and the result was cleaner. Not perfect, but hers. Her hands were changing. Calluses had formed on her palms where the tools pressed, and no matter how carefully she scrubbed at the end of the day, there was always a crescent of paint or dirt lodged in the creases of her knuckles. They were becoming the hands of a person who touched things instead of a person who was careful not to. She was painting the kitchen window on a Thursday afternoon when she heard footsteps on the front walk and a voice she did not expect. Satin or semi-gloss. She turned. A man stood at the fence line, tall, thin, 74 years old if he was a day. He had the look of someone who had spent his life listening to other people talk and had gotten very good at hearing what they were not saying. Satin, Ramona said. The man at the hardware store said it holds up better. He is right. The man stayed where he was, hands in his pockets, examining her brushwork with no particular urgency. I am Kermit, number 7, retired pastor, if that matters to anyone. It did not seem to matter to him whether it mattered to her. He nodded once and kept walking. Kermit did not come by often, but when he did, he was different from the others. Verna brought bread and warmth and the gift of asking nothing. Reva brought silence and standards and the particular kindness of treating Ramona no differently than she treated anyone else. Kermit brought questions. Not many, just the ones nobody else was asking. It happened a week later. Ramona was on the front porch working on the railing when Kermit stopped again. She had been telling him without quite meaning to about the courtroom, about the settlement, about the receipt on the counter she had left in the open instead of folding it away. Kermit listened. Then he said, "Did you leave because you were brave or because you were afraid of what it would cost to stay and fight?" The question landed in the center of Ramona's chest and sat there. She opened her mouth to answer, found nothing there, and closed it again. Kermit watched her for a moment with no judgment in his expression. Then he said good afternoon and walked back down the sidewalk toward number 7 with the unhurried pace of a man who had learned that the most important conversations do not end when someone walks away. Ramona stood on the porch holding her paintbrush and did not move for a long time. She had spent 2 weeks telling herself a story about courage, about a woman who stood up in a courtroom and chose herself. Kermit had just asked her whether the story was true, and she did not know. On a Tuesday morning at the end of September, Ramona heard a truck pull up along the garden fence line. She was working the far bed, the one with the tomatoes Verna had mentioned, feeling her way through the difference between a weed and a volunteer plant, when a man got out of the truck bed, took out a toolbox and a length of cedar fencing and carried them to the section of fence that had been leaning since August. He did not look around. He did not announce himself. He just started working. Verna appeared at her elbow 10 minutes later. "That is Perry," she said. "My son. That fence has been on his list since July. He gets to things." She called over to him. Perry looked up. He was 62, salt and pepper hair, cut close work boots that had creases in the leather from actual use. He nodded once in Ramona's direction. Ramona nodded back. That was the introduction. They worked near each other for 2 hours, Perry on the fence and Ramona moving between the beds with the watering can. At one point, she mentioned that the tomatoes on the south end were getting leggy, not enough direct sun, because the leaning fence section was casting shade where it should not be. Perry said the repair should help once the posts were straightened, open up the light. She said that made sense. He went back to work. She noticed things she had not intended to notice. The way he assessed each fence post before touching it, reading the lean, the rot, the wood that could be saved, and the wood that could not, and only then reaching for the right tool. 3 solid hammer strikes a pause, 2 more to set, no wasted motion, no explanation. He worked through each problem in the order it presented itself, giving each one exactly the attention it required and nothing more. She realized after 40 minutes that she had been listening to the rhythm of his hammer without being aware of when that rhythm had become the background of her morning. She had not paid attention to a stranger in years. She had been too occupied managing a household where no one noticed she was there. Perry finished around 10. He loaded his tools, said goodbye to Verna near the greenhouse, and raised a hand in Ramona's general direction without quite looking at her, the gesture of someone who has registered your presence without needing to make it into anything. He got in the truck and left. Verna came to stand beside her. She spoke in a low voice, the way you say something when you want it heard but not picked up and examined. His wife passed 5 years ago. Cancer. 2 years of watching it. A pause. He is not a bad man. He just has not figured out how to be close to people again. Ramona watched the truck turn at the end of the street. She did not say anything. She thought about the particular relief of standing next to someone who was not asking a single thing of her. In the mansion, she had spent 31 years being needed in ways that shrank her. Here was a man who needed nothing from her at all, and somehow that felt like the most generous thing she had been offered in a decade. 3 weeks after she moved in on a Thursday afternoon when the light was starting to take on the amber quality of early autumn, Ramona was painting the front fence. Second coat. She had learned to slow down to let the bristles do the work to stop 2 inches before the corner and come back to it with a fresh load. She was focused on the bottom rail when she heard a car she did not recognize. A white SUV pulled to the curb. The door opened and a woman stepped out. Blonde hair pulled back. Professional clothing. Shoes that were not made for unpaved walkways. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking at number 12 with an expression Ramona had seen before on the faces of realtors appraising a property they already knew was beneath them. Francine Crandall, Judson's younger sister, 58 years old, real estate broker, the member of the Calloway family who always sat at the head of the Thanksgiving table, even when it was not her house, because she had the kind of presence that rearranged rooms around itself. "Ramona, I need to talk to you." Ramona set the paintbrush across the top of the can. She did not stand up. Francine came up the front path. Her heels caught in the uneven ground twice. She stopped a few feet from the porch step and opened the portfolio. Inside were documents, legal documents with the kind of heavy paper and small print that meant someone had paid a lawyer to prepare them. She explained, the house at 12 Elm Street, when Ramona and Judson had purchased it 35 years ago, both names had been placed on the deed. When they moved to the mansion, no one had filed a transfer. Judson's name was still on the original title. Under the terms of the divorce settlement, Ramona had relinquished her claim to marital property, and this house technically could be classified as marital property. Judson wanted it sold. Francine had come to persuade Ramona to sign. "You know my brother," Francine said. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of a woman who had spent her career making difficult conversations sound like reasonable ones. "He does not let go of things that belong to him." Ramona looked at the documents. She looked at Francine's shoes sinking slightly into the soft ground beside the porch step. She looked at the fence she had just painted, still wet, gleaming in the afternoon light. "Would you like a glass of water?" she said. Francine blinked. "Excuse me? Water. I only have tap, but it is cold." Ramona did not sign. She brought Francine inside, poured 2 glasses of water from the kitchen faucet, and sat across from her at the small table while Francine's eyes moved around the room cataloging everything. The second-hand chairs, the camping stove still sitting on the counter, the paint cans stacked by the back door. Francine was pricing the house in her head. Ramona could see it running the numbers on square footage and lot size and condition, the professional reflex she could not turn off any more than a doctor could stop noticing a limp. "This house is worth maybe $90,000, Francine said. "In this condition, maybe less. Judson would get half." "You are fighting over scraps, Ramona." "I am not fighting over anything," Ramona said. "I am drinking water in my kitchen." Francine left an hour later with unsigned documents and an expression Ramona could not quite read. It might have been frustration. It might have been something else. At the door, Francine paused and looked back at the room one more time, and for a moment her professional mask slipped just slightly, and underneath it was the face of a woman who was tired. Then she was gone. The SUV pulled away and the street was quiet again. That afternoon, Kermit appeared. He had seen the SUV. He did not ask who it was or what they wanted. He simply sat on the porch step next to Ramona and was quiet for a while. "Do you have a lawyer?" he asked. "I cannot afford one, not for this. I know someone. She is retired. She takes cases, sometimes the ones that interest her. Lives on the other side of town." He did not promise anything. He placed a possibility on the table between them, the way you set a tool down within reach of someone who might need it, and then he left. That was Kermit. He did not rescue. He opened doors and let people decide for themselves whether to walk through. Francine came back 2 days later. No portfolio this time. It was raining, a cold, steady rain that turned the unpaved edges of Elm Street to mud. She said her car was having trouble. Ramona was not sure she believed that, but she let her in. They sat in the kitchen. Verna brought wine because Verna had a sense for when something was happening on the street that required wine. The 3 of them sat around the small table, and the rain hit the windows in gusts, and the kitchen was warm, because Ramona had finally figured out the thermostat, which required turning it past the point where it clicked and then back again, a trick she had learned by accident on the coldest night of the week. Verna left at 9, Francine did not. She sat at the table, turning her wine glass slowly by the stem, staring at the surface of the wine, as if it contained something she was trying to read. Ramona waited. She had spent 31 years learning to wait. Then Francine spoke. "I know about Judson, the affairs." She said it to the wine glass, not to Ramona. "Not just now, I have known for a long time." The kitchen was very quiet. Rain on glass. the old house ticking as it cooled. This is not the first time, Ramona. The first time was year 8. A woman at his firm. It lasted almost 2 years, our mother knew. A pause that lasted long enough for Ramona to hear her own heartbeat. She told me to keep quiet. Francine looked up. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady in the way of someone who has been carrying something for so long that the carrying itself has become a kind of discipline. I kept quiet 23 years. Ramona sat very still. She was aware of her hands on the table in front of her, the paint in the creases, the calluses. She was aware of the rain and the wine and the small kitchen and the woman across from her who had just handed her a piece of information that rearranged everything she thought she knew about her own life. 31 years she had been married. She had believed the silence was only hers, that she was the only one swallowing the truth to keep the peace. But Francine had been swallowing it too, and their mother-in-law before her, and perhaps others she would never know about. A chain of women keeping quiet so that one man could keep doing what he was doing without consequence. Year 8. Preston would have been 9 years old. Ramona tried to remember what year 8 had looked like from the inside. She could not find it. It was buried under all the other years, indistinguishable, the way one Tuesday is indistinguishable from another when you are not paying attention to the calendar. 23 years, she had thought she was protecting a marriage by staying silent. She had been protecting a pattern. Francine was crying now, quietly the way women cry when they have had a lot of practice doing it without being noticed. Ramona did not cry. She poured more wine for both of them. Her hand was steady. "Why now?" Ramona asked. Francine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Because he is wrong to try to take this house from you. And because I am tired, Ramona. I am so tired of carrying his secrets." They sat for a while longer. The rain continued. Ramona did not tell Francine it was all right because it was not. She did not tell her she forgave her because forgiveness was not the word for what she felt. What she felt was the strange, cold clarity of seeing the full shape of something for the first time and understanding that the shape was larger and uglier than she had imagined, and also that she had survived it, and also that the woman sitting across from her had survived it too, and that survival, however imperfect, was not nothing. The phone rang on a Thursday evening. Ramona had been eating alone at the kitchen table, thinking vaguely about whether the side yard got enough sun for tomatoes. The screen lit up with Preston's name. Her son was 40 years old. He lived in Chicago and worked in finance, and called on Sundays, usually mid-afternoon, his voice carrying the careful pleasantness of a man checking items off a weekly list. This was a Thursday evening. Thursday evening calls were a different thing. "Mom," his voice was careful, the kind of careful that means someone has rehearsed the opening sentence. "Hi, sweetheart. I talked to Dad." A pause that contained everything that was about to follow. "He said you walked away from the settlement, that you refused what the lawyers agreed on and just left. He said you gave up the house. Is that true?" "It is more complicated than did you give up the house." "Is it true?" Ramona told him. 3 receipts over 2 years. She kept her voice even. She told it in order. When she finished, Preston was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing through the phone, the sound of a man organizing his thoughts before he speaks, and she recognized the rhythm of it because it was the same rhythm Judson used. Not the words. The architecture of the silence before the words. Then he said, "Do you have any evidence, or is this just how you are seeing it?" Evidence. The word arrived in the kitchen and sat down at the table between them like an uninvited guest. Ramona thought about the drawer in the mansion kitchen, 3 folded pieces of paper she had left behind when she packed her one suitcase, left behind deliberately, or maybe forgotten. Or maybe she had not been able to decide which, and the not deciding had made the choice for her. I know what I found, she said. Dad says there is another explanation, that you were already looking for a way out and you just used this as a reason. Preston, I am not saying he is right. I am just telling you what he said. I know what I found. He did not push further, but he did not say he believed her either. The call wound down the way calls do when both people have run out of the words that would actually help. A few careful sentences, a promise to talk soon, a goodbye that landed with the particular flatness of something left unfinished. Ramona set the phone on the table. Her own son, 40 years old, and the tone of his voice, that careful, measured reasonableness, was so familiar, it made her stomach tighten. He had not learned it from a textbook. He had learned it across dinner tables and in hallways, where the sound carried the way a boy learns to move through the world by watching his father move through it first. Judson's voice coming through her son's mouth, not the words, the temperature. She went to the sink, turned on the water, washed the bowl she had eaten from. It was clean after the first pass. She washed it again and again, standing at the sink scrubbing a clean bowl for the third time while the water ran warm over her hands, and the window above the sink showed nothing but her own reflection in the dark glass. She had been prepared to lose Judson. She had not been prepared for Preston to ask her for evidence. A week later, a number she did not recognize appeared on her phone. She answered it standing in the kitchen doorway, one hand on the frame, the afternoon light coming through at an angle that made the dust motes visible in the air. Mom, it is Joellen, Preston's wife, 34 years old. A woman Ramona liked but did not know well, the way you do not know the people your children choose because your children have become careful about how much of their lives they share with you. Joellen spoke quickly, her voice low. The voice of someone making a phone call she is not sure she should be making. I do not know if I should be calling, but I think you should know. Preston has not been sleeping since the night he called you. He does not talk about it, but I know. He gets up at 3 in the morning and sits in the kitchen in the dark. A pause. Ramona could hear something in the background, a television maybe, or a child's voice. The sounds of a life being lived around the edges of this phone call. I am not taking sides, Joellen said. I just think there are things he is not ready to say yet. The call was short. Joellen hung up before Ramona could say much, but she sat with the information for a long time, standing in the doorway with her hands still on the frame. Her son, the man who had asked for evidence. He was sitting in his kitchen at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, which meant that somewhere beneath the careful, reasonable surface of that phone call, something was cracking. Not breaking, not yet, but shifting, finding a new position. The way a person does when the story they have been telling themselves about their own father starts to develop a crack they cannot look away from. Reva did not bring warmth the way Verna did. She brought something harder and more durable. When Ramona painted the front fence, Reva came out, looked at Ramona, went back inside without a word. 2 hours later, a jar of preserves sat on the bottom porch step. No note, plum by the color, homemade by the handwritten label, just the word plum and a year 2 summers ago. That evening turned into the first Friday gathering, though nobody planned it that way. Verna knocked, brought wine. Reva appeared at the door with a plate of something covered in foil, set it on the table and sat down beside it as if she had been invited specifically, which she had not. Fletcher came by, and Ardith, a younger woman from the garden with her daughter, who found the best corner of the room for drawing and settled there without a word. 7 people in a kitchen built for 4. They pulled the table out through the back door and set it up in the yard. Verna had brought string lights. I always have string lights, she said in a tone that did not invite questions, and they hung them between the 2 trees flanking the back fence and the yard turned into the kind of place that makes you slow down without knowing why. The talk went around the table the way talk does among people who are still learning each other. Fletcher had brought something in a pot that he refused to identify until everyone had tried it. Ardith's daughter fell asleep in her chair and was carried inside and laid on the couch without the conversation pausing. Ramona sat at the end of the table and listened to all of it, the laughter, the forks on plates, the way stories overlapped and interrupted and circled back, and she felt the cold night air pressing in at the edges of the light and the warmth of the person beside her and the particular sweetness of belonging to something she had not earned but had been given anyway. 3 days later, as Ramona was sweeping the back step, Reva's voice carried across the street from her own front yard where she was doing something with a trowel and a pot of late-season chrysanthemums. Same time Friday. She said it without looking up. Ramona looked over. Reva did not look back. Yes, Ramona said. Reva nodded once, the nod of someone who has settled something, and kept working. Ramona stood there with the broom in her hand and understood that she had passed a test she had not known she was taking. She had been waiting for belonging to feel like an arrival. It turned out it felt more like a Friday night that nobody had planned and everybody showed up for anyway. And then the phone rang again. Not Preston, not Joellen. Francine. Her voice was different this time, stripped of the professional smoothness Ramona had heard on the porch and in the kitchen. Underneath that voice was another one, raw, unpolished, the voice of a 58-year-old woman who had made a decision and was terrified of it. I called Judson's lawyer this morning, Francine said. I told them I will testify about year 8, about all of it, if you need me to. Ramona gripped the phone. Outside the kitchen window, the street was quiet. Verna's house across the way, the garden at the end of the block. The life she was building from scraps and paint and bread brought by strangers. Francine, do not thank me. I should have said something 23 years ago. I am not doing you a favor. I am trying to live with myself. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Francine said, he is going to drop the claim on the house. I made sure of that. But Ramona, you need to know something else. What? He has not stopped. Whatever he told Preston, whatever story he is selling, he has not stopped. I saw his credit card statement last week. Same hotel, same room. 2 weeks after the courtroom. Ramona closed her eyes, of course. Of course he had not stopped. Stopping would mean admitting something was wrong, and Judson Brennan had built his entire life on the principle that nothing was ever wrong, that everything could be explained, reframed, repositioned, managed. He did not stop because stopping was not in his vocabulary. But the information landed differently than it would have landed 6 months ago. 6 months ago, it would have been a knife. Now it was a fact, a cold, clear, unsurprising fact. The kind you file away not because it hurts, but because it confirms what you already knew, the way a doctor confirms a diagnosis you suspected but hoped was wrong. She opened her eyes. Through the kitchen window, she could see the fence she had painted drying in the last of the afternoon light. She could see the yard, the chairs, the string lights still hanging from the Friday gathering. She could see Reva's porch across the street and Verna's mailbox and the maple tree throwing long shadows down the sidewalk. She had $120,000 and it was getting smaller. She had a house that needed a new roof and probably new plumbing and certainly new insulation before winter set in hard. She had a son who did not believe her. She had a community that had opened its arms to her without asking why she needed them. She had a diary full of empty pages and a question from a retired pastor she still could not answer. And she had paint on her hands, and the second coat on the fence was not going to finish itself. Thank you, Francine, she said. She hung up the phone. She picked up her brush, and she kept painting because that was the only thing she knew for certain she could do, And because somewhere in the last 6 weeks she had learned that the truest form of courage was not the grand gesture in the courtroom. It was this: going back outside, picking up the brush, finishing what you started even when someone was trying to take the wall out from under you. The paint went on smooth. The light was fading. Somewhere down the street, Verna's porch light flickered on and the evening settled over Elm Street, the way evenings do, gently without asking permission, carrying with it the sound of someone's television through an open window and the smell of someone's dinner and the ordinary kindness of a neighborhood where people leave their lights on for each other without being asked. The pipe burst at 2 in the morning on the coldest night in November. Ramona woke to a sound she had never heard before, a high, thin hiss followed by a dull rushing, like a faucet turned on full inside the wall. She lay still for 3 seconds, her body catching up with her brain, and then she was on her feet in the dark hallway in bare feet and a sweater she had fallen asleep wearing. The kitchen floor was already wet. Water was pooling from under the sink, spreading in a dark, uneven sheet across the old linoleum. And the hiss was louder now. Angry pressurized the sound of copper that had held for 35 years, finally giving out in the cold. She dropped to her knees and opened the cabinet under the sink. The shut-off valve was somewhere behind the pipes, but she could not see it and she could not feel it. And the water was hitting her arms and soaking through her sweater, and the cold was sharp enough to make her fingers clumsy. She tried to turn something and it would not move. She tried another and it broke off in her hand, a small, corroded handle that crumbled like chalk. She stood up, water on the floor now reaching the edge of the hallway. She put on shoes. She went across the street and knocked on Verna's door. Verna answered in a bathrobe, took one look at Ramona's face and said, "I will call Perry." Perry arrived in 20 minutes. He came through the front door carrying a flashlight in one hand and his toolbox in the other, and he did not ask what happened. He walked into the kitchen, looked at the water, looked at the pipe reached behind the sink to a valve Ramona had not been able to find in the dark, and turned it. The hissing stopped. The water slowed and then ceased, leaving the kitchen floor covered in a shallow, cold lake that reflected the beam of his flashlight. "Copper," Perry said, the first word he had spoken since arriving. He pointed the flashlight at the split in the pipe. "Too old. Frozen split." Then Fletcher appeared. No one had called him. He had seen the lights from his window at number 11 and come out in his coat and his veteran's cap, carrying a heavy wool blanket under one arm and a thermos of coffee he must have made in under 10 minutes. He set the thermos on the table, draped the blanket over a kitchen chair for Ramona, and stood by the back door with his hands in his pockets, ready to help, and equally ready to simply be there if helping was not required. The three of them sat in the wet kitchen at 3 in the morning, drinking coffee from Fletcher's thermos and waiting for daylight. Perry explained what needed to happen. The old copper under the house had to come out, replaced with PEX, a flexible plastic line that would not freeze the same way. He had the materials in his truck. It was a day's work, maybe a day and a half, if the crawl space under the house was tight. "I can start at first light," Perry said. He said it to the coffee, not to Ramona, the way he said most things, directed at the problem rather than the person. "I want to help," Ramona said. Perry looked at her for the first time since he had arrived. Not surprised, considering. Then he nodded once. At dawn, Perry went under the house. Ramona handed tools down through the access panel, lying on her stomach on the cold ground with her arm extended into the crawl space. Fletcher held the flashlight, angling it where Perry pointed, adjusting without being asked. They worked for 3 hours. The language between them was the language of the job. 3/4 wrench. "Hold this. Hand me the cutter. Pull that section toward you." Short words, functional, stripped of everything except what was needed to get the next thing done. Perry taught Ramona to tell good pipe from bad by tapping it with a wrench. A clear ring meant solid copper with life left in it. A flat, dull thud meant corrosion on the inside metal that looked fine on the surface but was hollowed out underneath, ready to fail the first time the temperature dropped below a certain point. She tapped her way along a section of pipe under the kitchen and found two more spots where the sound went dead. "Those two," Perry said from deeper in the crawl space, "while we are down here." When they finished, Perry reconnected the water line and turned the valve. They stood in the kitchen, all three of them, and watched the faucet. Water came through, clean, steady, no hiss, no leak. Perry watched it run for a full 10 seconds, then he turned it off and dried his hands on his jeans. Fletcher picked up his empty thermos, nodded at both of them, and left without saying goodbye. The nod was the goodbye, the kind that means I will be back and does not need to say it. Perry stayed a few minutes longer. He was looking around the kitchen with the eye of someone who reads a house the way other people read faces. Ramona could see him cataloging things: the window frames she had painted, the bulbs she had replaced, the thermostat with its trick of turning past the click and back. He did not compliment any of it. He simply looked, and she understood that looking was how Perry paid respect to work that had been done. "This house was built well," he said. He was still not looking at her. He was looking at the joint where the wall met the ceiling, where the original plaster had held without cracking for 3.5 decades. Good bones, just need someone who knows how to listen to it. Then he left. The truck pulled away. The street was quiet. Ramona stood in the kitchen. The floor was still damp. Her sweater was soaked. Her hands were cold and scratched from the crawlspace gravel, and she could feel the ache in her shoulders from lying on her stomach for 2 hours passing tools into a hole in the ground. And she felt something she had not felt in 31 years. She had asked for help, and it had come, and the cost of receiving it had been nothing. No silence traded, no part of herself diminished. Perry fixed the pipe and Fletcher brought coffee, and neither of them kept a ledger. On a gray afternoon in December, Ramona and Kermit worked on the front steps of the old building at the end of the block. It had been a small church once decades ago before the congregation moved to a larger space across town. Now it served as the community's storage shed and meeting place, its pews replaced by garden tools and folding chairs, and a coffee maker that someone had donated and no one had claimed responsibility for. The steps were rotting. Kermit had the lumber. Ramona had the hammer. She had learned the grip by now, choking up near the head for accuracy, 2 taps to set the nail, and 1 solid strike to drive it. They worked side by side, measuring and cutting and fitting the new boards into the old frame, and the cold air smelled like sawdust, and the sky hung low and flat above the rooftops. Kermit was quiet for the first hour. Then he spoke, and his voice had a different quality than Ramona had heard from him before. Not the careful probing of a man asking a question. Something more exposed, something offered. "My wife died 12 years ago," he said. He was fitting a board into place, checking the level with his eye, adjusting it a fraction of an inch. "After the funeral, I kept preaching. 6 months, a year. Every Sunday I stood up there and said words I had been saying for 40 years. And then one Sunday I stood at the pulpit and there was nothing, not a blank, not a block, nothing. I looked down at the congregation and I did not believe a single thing I was about to say." He picked up a nail and positioned it. "I stepped down. The church board said I needed rest. I said I did not need rest. I needed to stop pretending. They did not care for that answer." Ramona held the board steady while he drove the nail. 2 taps, 1 strike, clean. "What did you do?" "Came here, fixed things, planted tomatoes badly. First year they all died. Second year was better. Third year I had enough to give away." He set the hammer down and looked at her. You ask me if I believe again. I believe in this step. I believe it needs fixing, and I am fixing it. The rest of it I am still working on. They finished the steps by late afternoon. Ramona sat on the new wood and ran her hand along the grain. Solid, level, the kind of work that would hold through weather. Kermit sat beside her. You never answered my question, he said, about whether you left because of courage or fear. Ramona looked down the street. She could see her house from here. Number 12, the painted fence, the porch with its slight lean. She could see Verna's place and Reva's, and the garden beds resting under their winter mulch. Both, she said. I think it was both. Kermit considered this. Then he said, that is the first honest answer you have given me. And he was right, it was. Trudy Ives was 72 years old, and she drank her tea without sugar, and she did not waste words. Ramona sat across from her at her kitchen table, which was covered with papers and law books and a plate of crackers that had been there long enough to suggest they were decorative rather than functional. Kermit had called ahead. Trudy had agreed to look at the documents. She spent 20 minutes reading. Then she set the papers down and looked at Ramona over the rim of her glasses. You bought this house before the marriage. Your money, your loan application. His name was added to the deed afterward as a convenience. The original mortgage paperwork will show that. I need to find it. Yes, you do. Ramona found it that evening, not in the hall closet, not in the shoebox with the diary. Under the floorboard in the bedroom, the third board from the window, the one that had always been slightly loose that popped up if you stepped on the right corner. She had kept a tin box under there since she was 29 years old. Inside the original loan documents signed in her maiden name, Preston's birth certificate, a wedding photograph, two young people standing on church steps, Ramona in a borrowed dress, Judson smiling the kind of smile you smile when you believe the future is a straight line pointing up. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she set it aside and took out the loan papers. Trudy sent them to Judson's attorney. The response came by email 4 days later. 3 sentences. Judson was withdrawing his claim to the property at 12 Elm Street. No apology, no acknowledgement, just withdrawal, the legal equivalent of a man leaving a room without closing the door behind him. Francine called that evening. He did not say a word about it. She said, but you are keeping the house. Yes? Good. A pause. Ramona, I am glad. And she sounded like she meant it, which from Francine Crandall was something. Winter settled in. The days shortened. Ramona learned which windows let drafts in and stuffed them with towels she bought at the thrift store on 3rd Avenue. She learned that the bedroom door swelled in humidity and needed to be lifted slightly while pushing to open without noise. She learned that on the coldest mornings, the hot water took 4 full minutes to reach the kitchen sink, and she learned to fill the kettle the night before so she could boil water for coffee while she waited. $120,000 was not a lot of money. She kept a notebook with her expenses written in pencil, each line a small negotiation between what the house needed and what she could afford. New insulation, a space heater for the bathroom, caulk for the windows. She bought nothing that was not necessary. She repaired what she could and left the rest for later. She was learning the math of a life built on less, and the math was tight, and some weeks it was very tight, but it was hers. Every number in that notebook was a decision she had made, not a decision that had been made around her. Joellen drove from Chicago on a Tuesday in January, 6 hours on the highway with Thea in the back seat. Ramona opened the door and found her daughter-in-law and her granddaughter standing on the porch, Thea's nose red from the cold, her eyes wide with the particular excitement of a child arriving somewhere new. Thea was 4 years old, and she moved through the house the way children move through any space they have not been told to be careful in freely, with complete confidence that the world was arranged for her benefit. She found the corner of the living room where the afternoon light made a warm square on the floor and sat in it and began to draw. She found the crystal doorknob on Preston's old closet and turned it back and forth until Ramona heard the familiar loose rattle she had been meaning to fix since 1994. Joellen stood in the hallway and looked at the pencil marks on the doorframe. She read the dates in silence, her fingers tracing the column of notations the way Ramona's own fingers had traced them months ago. "Preston never told me about this house," she said. "He does not talk much about growing up." "No," Ramona said, "he does not." They stayed 2 days. Reva met Thea in the garden and assigned her a watering can that was too big for her, which Thea carried with both hands, and a seriousness that made Reva's mouth do something Ramona had never seen it do before, which was almost smile. Fletcher let Thea wear his veteran's cap, adjusting the band so it sat on her small head instead of falling over her eyes, and he watched her water the winter kale with an expression that contained decades of something he did not talk about. Perry came by on the second day to check the pipes he had replaced. He saw Thea in the garden struggling with the watering can water sloshing over the sides and onto her boots, and he stopped. He stood by his truck and watched her for a moment, and then he did something Ramona had not seen him do in all the weeks she had known him. He smiled, not a large smile, not a performance, just the brief, involuntary movement of a man's face when something catches him off guard by being purely good. Joelle and Maya noticed. She looked at Ramona. Ramona looked back. Neither of them said anything. The morning Joellen left, she hugged Ramona at the car. Thea was already buckled in, waving through the window. Joellen held on longer than the usual farewell hug required. Then she pulled back and said quietly, "He is coming. He is not ready to tell you yet, but he is." Then they were gone. Preston hosts the restaurant. It was a Wednesday noon, a quiet place near the center of town with good lighting and tables spaced far enough apart that you could have a conversation without performing it for the people next to you. The kind of restaurant you choose when you want everything about the environment to be neutral, so that whatever happens between the people at the table is the only thing that matters. Ramona arrived first. She sat at the table and ordered nothing and waited. She had dressed that morning for herself. There was a difference, and she was only recently learning to feel it. For 31 years, she had dressed with Judson in mind. Today, she wore a sweater she liked because she liked it, and boots she had bought at the thrift store that were comfortable and warm, and she did not check her reflection before leaving the house. Judson came in 5 minutes later. He scanned the room before sitting. The old habit, checking who was there, who might see him, calculating the audience before choosing his performance. He sat down across from Ramona and nodded. She nodded back. They waited. Preston came through the door with his coat still buttoned the way he wore it when he was tense and had not noticed yet. He was 40 years old, and he looked uncertain in a way that had nothing to do with the restaurant and everything to do with the two people already sitting at the table. He sat down between them, not beside his mother, not beside his father, equidistant, the geometry of a man trying not to choose. Judson ordered water. Preston ordered coffee. Ramona ordered nothing. Judson spoke first. He was precise, measured, fluent in the language of reasonable concern. He said Ramona needed proper support. He said the situation on Elm Street was not sustainable. He said he was worried. He said Preston was worried. He said there were options, better options, if she was willing to be practical about the future. He delivered all of this in the voice of a man presenting facts, and anyone listening from the next table would have heard a caring ex-husband trying to help, and they would have been wrong. Ramona watched Preston's hands. They were wrapped around the coffee cup, both hands the way you hold something when you need an anchor. She had known those hands since they were small enough to close around a single one of her fingers. She could see the tension in his knuckles, the stillness that meant he had already decided something but was not ready to speak it. Judson finished. He leaned back slightly, the posture of a man who has made his case and is now waiting for the verdict he already knows will go his way. Ramona placed her hand flat on the table, not reaching for anyone, not gripping anything, just her hand open steady resting on the surface between them. Preston. He looked up. Finally, his eyes met hers and she could see it, all the sleepless nights Joellen had told her about, the 3 a.m. kitchen vigils, the weight of a question he had been carrying since the day she told him about the receipts, and he had asked for evidence instead of offering belief. "You do not have to agree with me," she said, "but I need you to know that I do not need to be rescued. I just need to be believed." The words hung in the air between them. Preston opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Judson shifted in his chair. Ramona stood up, not angry, not dramatic, finished. She had said the thing she came to say, and she could see from Preston's face that what came next needed to happen without her in the room. "Thank you for setting this up," she said to Preston. She meant it. She put on her coat, picked up her bag, and walked out through the lunch crowd and into the cold, bright afternoon. She sat in her car for a long time. The windshield showed her the ordinary street, people going about their Wednesday, a man walking a dung, a woman on her phone laughing at something. The world continuing. She sat with her hands in her lap and breathed and did not start the engine and let the fact of what had just happened settle into her body at its own pace. She had asked her son to believe her. He had not answered. That silence was going to live inside her for a while. She would have to make room for it. She drove home. Verna was on her porch, though it was too cold for porches. She saw Ramona's car pull in, and she came across the street without being asked, and she sat down on the step beside Ramona, and they stayed there together until the cold was too much and the street went quiet, and neither of them had spoken a word. Verna did not ask what happened. She did not need to. She sat. That was enough. That was everything. 3 weeks later, a Saturday morning in late February, the air had the raw, clean bite of a winter that was beginning to think about ending, but had not committed yet. Ramona was in the kitchen making coffee, the real kind. Now she had bought a proper pot from the thrift store when she heard a car pull up outside. Not a car she recognized, not Perry's truck or Verna's sedan or Francine's SUV. She looked through the window, a rental car, blue, Illinois plates. Preston got out. He stood at the front gate for a long time. She watched him from the window and did not go to the door. He was looking at the house. She could see his eyes moving across the painted fence, the porch with its lean, the yard where the maple tree's bare branches made a lattice against the gray sky. He was looking at it the way you look at a place you are seeing for the first time and recognizing at the same time a place that existed in a part of your memory you did not know you still had. He opened the gate, came up the walk. His steps were slow. She went to the door and opened it before he knocked. They did not embrace. Not yet. They stood in the doorway and looked at each other, and the space between them was full of everything that had not been said on the phone and at the restaurant and in all the silences that had accumulated between them over the past months. "Can I come in?" he said. She stepped aside. He walked through the house slowly, through the kitchen with its thrift store coffee pot and the window frames she had painted, and the linoleum floor that was clean, now mopped and swept and lived on. Through the living room where the secondhand furniture had arranged itself into something that looked like home. Down the short hallway to his old room. He stopped in the doorway. The pencil marks, his mother's handwriting, the dates, 6 months, 1 year, 18 months, climbing the frame in a column that recorded every version of himself he had ever been preserved in graphite, and the pressure of a pencil held by a woman who wanted to make sure the marks would last. He put his finger on the last one. August 12th, first day of school. The mark was at his mother's shoulder height, which meant he had been small, then small enough that this doorframe had been his whole world, small enough that standing against it while his mother drew a line and wrote a date had felt important in the way that only small things feel important to children. He stood there with his back to her. She could see his shoulders moving, not shaking, just moving the way a person's body moves when it is processing something the mind has not caught up with yet. "I found a receipt in Dad's desk," he said. His voice was low and rough. Same hotel, 2 weeks after the courthouse. He kept his hand on the doorframe. "You were right. You were right the whole time, and I asked you for evidence instead of just believing you." Ramona stood in the hallway. She did not move toward him. "I am sorry, Mom." She waited, not because she needed more, because she could tell he was not finished. He turned around. His eyes were red, but his face was open in a way she had not seen since he was young enough to stand against this doorframe, open the way people are when they have stopped defending themselves and are simply standing in whatever they feel without trying to manage it or explain it or make it smaller. "I believe you," he said. 3 words. Ramona had not counted how long she had been waiting for them. She only knew that hearing them felt like the first warm day after a winter that went on too long. Not dramatic, not a sudden change, just the sun reaching you through a window you forgot was there. She crossed the hallway and took his hands. His hands were large now. They had been small enough once to fit entirely inside her palm. She had measured their growth on this very doorframe. She had watched them learn to hold a pencil while, a shoe grip, a baseball bat, shake hands at a job interview. Now they held hers and they were shaking slightly, and she held them steady. She did not say, "I forgive you." There was nothing to forgive. Believing someone is the hardest thing in the world when it requires you to doubt someone you also love. He had not been cruel. He had been caught between 2 people he trusted, and the truth had taken time to find him on its own. It had found him in a desk drawer the same way it had found her in a jacket pocket, unbidden and undeniable. They sat on the floor of his old room. The way she had sat here on the first day courthouse clothes and all, back against the wall. Except now there were 2 of them. Mother and son sitting on the dusty floor with their shoulders almost touching, and the winter light coming through the window in a long, pale column. "This room is smaller than I thought," Preston said. "I know," Ramona said. "I thought the same thing." He stayed the night, sleeping bag on the floor of his old room the same way Ramona had slept there on her first night back. Through the wall she could hear him shifting, finding a comfortable position, the sounds of a body negotiating with a hard floor, and she lay in her own bed and listened to it and felt the particular fullness of a house that has someone in it again. After she heard his breathing slow and deepen, she got up. She went to the kitchen. She turned on the light above the stove, the dim one, the one that cast a small, warm circle on the counter and left the rest of the room in shadow. The diary was on the table where she had left it months ago. Blue cover, drugstore purchase. She opened it, turned past the entries she had written 4 years ago, past the receipts and the drawer, and the fears she had circled without naming. Past the entry about year 2, the harder handwriting, the crossed-out paragraphs. Past the birthday entry, the last one she had written, the promise she had made to herself about bravery. Past the empty pages, all of them. She turned through every blank sheet until she reached the last one, and then she went back to the first empty page after the birthday entry, the page that had been waiting for 2 years for her to come back. She picked up a pen, not the old one with the dried ink, a new pen, blue ballpoint purchased at the hardware store on the same Tuesday she bought satin finish paint and a set of screwdrivers and a roll of plumber's tape. An ordinary pen from an ordinary errand on an ordinary day. She began to write. She did not write about Judson. She did not write about the receipts or the courtroom or the settlement or the 23 years Francine had kept silent. She did not write about evidence or lawyers or credit card statements. She wrote about bread, a loaf wrapped in a blue dish towel, still warm, brought to her door by a woman who asked no questions. She wrote about a row of beans planted by a man who was no longer alive, tended by a woman who did not explain why. She wrote about the sound of a hammer, 3 strikes, and a pause, and the rhythm becoming part of her morning before she noticed. She wrote about a retired pastor who asked the question no one else would ask, and who answered it himself by fixing a step. She wrote about a pipe bursting at 2 in the morning, and a man arriving with a flashlight and a toolbox, and another man arriving with a blanket and coffee, and the 3 of them sitting in a wet kitchen at 3 a.m., and none of them keeping score. She wrote about string lights hung between trees and a Friday evening that nobody planned. She wrote about a 4-year-old girl with a watering can too big for her body and the smile on a grieving man's face when he watched her carry it. She wrote about a daughter-in-law who made a phone call she was not sure she should make because some truths are too important to wait for the right moment. She wrote about a son who came back, who stood in a doorway and touched a pencil mark and said 3 words that mattered more than all the others. And at the bottom of the page, she wrote, "Today I know what brave looks like. It looks like picking up the brush when someone tells you to put it down. It looks like staying in a house that needs everything and discovering that you do too. It looks like opening the door when someone knocks and not asking them to explain why they came." She put the pen down. She did not close the diary. She left it open on the table the way she had left the receipt on the counter that morning in the mansion, the way she had left the truth in the light instead of folding it into a drawer. But this time it was not an accusation. It was an invitation to the next page, to the next day, to whatever came after this. Outside the kitchen window, Elm Street was dark and quiet. The February air pressed against the glass. Down the street, she could see Verna's porch light glowing warm and steady through the bare branches of the maple tree. It had been on the first night Ramona arrived, and it was on now, and she understood that it was always on, that Verna left it burning not for any particular reason, but because that was what you did on a street like this. You left a light on. You did not ask who it was for. Ramona sat in her kitchen. Her son was asleep in the next room. Her diary was open in front of her. Her hands resting on the table still carried the marks of the months behind her, the calluses from tools and the faint traces of paint that no amount of scrubbing would completely remove. They were not the hands she had walked into the courtroom with. They were not the hands that had folded 3 receipts and placed them in a drawer. They were the hands of a woman who had learned to build and to break and to hold on and to let go and to know the difference. She turned off the light above the stove. The kitchen went dark. Through the wall, her son breathed. She went to bed. She slept. And in the morning, she would get up and make coffee and check the pipes and walk to the garden. And there would be someone there working already, and someone would nod and she would nod back, and the day would begin the way days do on a street where people leave their lights on for each other. Not because they are asked to, because that is what you do.